Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to go through Zone 2 training. Zone 2 is a term that we hear a huge amount in the endurance community, and it's sort of considered the holy grail of training and training zones. Now, while it is extremely important and it's very beneficial, it's not the only training zone, but it does really bring its own sort of benefits that you can't really miss out on. So I'm going to go through what those are today so that those of you who maybe have never heard of Zone 2 or don't quite understand why it's so beneficial will get a little bit more of an insight into why you should be focusing a lot of your time on Zone 2 and how to do it properly. Before I get started, please make sure to hit the subscribe button and the little bell notification so you don't miss out on future videos. And make sure to like the video as well so that I see that this is the sort of topic you like to see and I can make more of them for you. Zone 2 training is simply just a classification of intensity that will be common in most zone training protocols. These protocols are used to make sure that you can control intensity and sort of map the different levels of intensity so that your training is effective and specific to the things you want to work on. Some of these protocols go up to maybe 7 or 8 zones, but Zone 2 tends to cover that sort of endurance portion of most of these protocols. They all look to do roughly the same thing, so it doesn't really make much of a difference which one you're using as long as you stay consistent. They just have different labels and different names to cover those physiological processes which are grouped within the intensity zones. You can see how I structure my training zones in a previous video I did by clicking on the little link that should be popping up in the video now.
So what is Zone 2 intensity? Well, it depends on a lot of factors what Zone 2 will actually be for you and what that heart rate range is going to be. But for most people it'll sit about 85% of threshold heart rate or maybe 75% of heart rate max. It just sort of depends on what formula you're going to use and what your sort of fitness levels and how you test. Now, one thing that we hear a lot of is that people say, you know, your Zone 2 is your pure aerobic zone, and this isn't entirely factual because we're always producing some energy through glycolysis and we're always producing some lactate. But our aerobic zone is able to use this lactate and recycle it as fuel, and so it prevents accumulation. So what this means is that we don't get any real accumulation of lactate, and that fatigue that comes from lactate accumulation isn't going to be a factor in Zone 2. And that's why it's something that we can do for relatively long periods of time, because we're relatively fatigue resistant at that intensity. When we're at Zone 2 intensity, our heart is actually at its most efficient, and when our heart beats, it pumps blood, but blood also returns to the heart. It stretches the heart, and this sort of elastic response helps it beat again to eject blood out. And at Zone 2, our heart is stretching at its fullest, and it's creating the largest stroke volume, which is the amount of blood pumped per pump. When we go above this intensity, our heart rate actually goes a lot quicker, and our heart literally doesn't get enough time to fill fully. So it becomes a little bit less efficient. And that's why we get a lot of good structural benefits from Zone 2 training, because it's when our heart is getting that most of its sort of stimulus that's going to help it grow and become a larger, more efficient heart. Now, that's not to be confused with thickening of the heart walls. This is literally a case of the chambers of the heart actually expanding to be able to cope with larger amounts of blood so that it can pump more per actual beat. Improving our aerobic efficiency is beneficial for a number of reasons, but mainly we can stay aerobic for longer up that intensity spectrum, so we can produce more power and we can run faster while our aerobic system makes up most of the demand for energy. And this is beneficial because A, it's less fatiguing, so we can sustain these efforts for longer, but also it takes a little bit of pressure off our fuel demands because we're able to process and get the most out of each sort of molecule of carbohydrate and glucose, because we're actually able to fully oxidize it down through the chain and then recycle the lactate. And this generally means that we have a little bit less of a demand for taking in exogenous fuel. So Zone 2 can make us a lot more fuel efficient, and basically means that we can run harder for longer without running out of energy. In addition, if we can produce less lactate or accumulate less lactate, we're also going to have better muscle function, because that lactate starts to interfere a little bit with the muscle's contraction when it accumulates. So the more aerobic we are, the harder we can go without it accumulating, and again sustain that effort for longer. One of the other benefits of Zone 2 training is that when you're doing long durations and large volumes of training in one session, you do have shifts in how you utilize fuel, and these sort of signals of running out of fuel and having to maintain, you know, your effort over longer periods are really powerful stimulators for a whole bunch of changes in the body that really improve your aerobic capacity. And it's going to be very hard to develop those types of things, oh, a bit mucky here, when you're doing shorter, harder sessions. And that's something that can really get neglected, and we see a lot of the time when people overemphasize high intensity training, that their ability to sustain their efforts over longer periods of time and their sort of fuel utilization diminish a little bit, and they start to struggle, and they actually start to experience, hitting the wall a lot earlier than those who've done a little bit more endurance training. And they're not necessarily slower, they can be quite fast, but they're just a little bit less efficient. So what type of work constitutes zone 2 training? Well, I'm not a million miles off zone 2 right now. I'm able to just about hold a full conversation, but I'm not doing my typical exercise. I can go hiking, I can run, I can do all sorts of cross training and still get that sort of cardiac benefit and develop that efficiency that will carry over to my chosen discipline. So zone 2, if you're just trying to build up volume, it's an excellent opportunity to go and do something different, to get outdoors, to explore new areas, and just kind of build volume at a sustainable but relative effort. I'm not exhausted here, but I'm definitely getting out of breath, and that's exactly that kind of level of intensity you want, that sort of conversational effort that you can sustain for longer periods of time. Another little thing that I love about zone 2 training is that you can incorporate a lot of different aspects. For example, if you're doing road running, you can incorporate some trail running to get some mixed surface, to be able to build some strength, and also do some of your running on a softer surface so that you sort of eliminate some of that impact, but also that sort of challenge in terrain, slightly rolly, muddy conditions. They just allow you to fill in the blanks. If you're constantly training on the same surface, or if you're constantly cycling on the flat, not the hills, for example, you don't get that exposure to some of the demands that you're going to see on race day. So getting out and incorporating some slightly different terrain isn't going to cost your speed work, but it is going to allow you to develop a little bit of strength, and also just teach you how to kind of relax when you do get faced with tougher conditions or tougher terrain. So one thing that is definitely worth keeping in mind when you're doing larger amounts of training is you do need to recover. You do need to allow for the time for those adaptations to take place, and with the increased volume comes an increase in impact and increase in potential wear and tear. So you do need to allow the body to actually respond, to let the muscles and ligaments strengthen up and become accustomed to that extra training that you're placing on your body. And some people increase the volume of their zone 2 too quickly. They obviously recognize the benefits of it and try to do a huge amount, and this is fine, but you just need to make sure that you're progressing steadily and conservatively, and actually allowing yourself to get those responses, to let those changes take place. If you just pile in a huge amount of volume of zone 2 work, you're likely just to get extremely fatigued and to really struggle with some of those other sessions you might have to do where intensity is required to sort of fill in the other aspects of your physiology that you're going to need for your event. So how much zone 2 training is enough to get its benefits? Well, the whole principle of zone 2 is that you're just building your ability to endure, and you're building capacity. So building up your duration of training is the key to actually developing that kind of endurance. And for somebody who's a relative beginner, that probably won't take a huge amount of training. That might be 20 minutes might actually see an adaptive response, but for somebody who's maybe elite or an elite marathoner, they might be going up to 3 hours plus, and for a cyclist it might be 5 hours plus. Ultra runners even more, it could be 5, 6, 7 hours in a day. And really it's just a case of building your capacity to efficiently work at that intensity, and the more volume you build nice and gradually, and the more you respond to it, the more you recover from it, the more it's going to allow you to achieve while staying aerobic. And while it's not the be all and end all of your training to do it all in zone 2, it does give all of those physiological adaptations that kind of carry all the way up the spectrum. You'll recover faster and you'll be just a lot more efficient all around, but it's not the only type of training you should do. Generally speaking, 80%, maybe a little bit more, depending on your volume, should be done around that sort of zone 2 intensity where you're building that big aerobic base. You generally don't need nearly as much high intensity work to get the benefit from it as you would zone 2. So sort of got a little bit of a bad name in terms of its time efficiency, that you need to do a large amount of zone 2 training to get its benefits, but you actually just need a large volume of training to get those sort of structural changes. It doesn't mean it's any less effective than high intensity work. you're just training something different. And when you rely on high intensity training, sometimes you neglect some of those changes that are only going to come about when you're training at an intensity where things are at their maximum efficiency. Like I said in response to the sort of the heart stretch, you won't get that at high intensity because your heart's not being stretched. It's being worked hard, it's working faster, but it's not stretching, so you don't get that same benefit. So I hope that's helped explain a little bit about zone 2 and why it's beneficial and why it's important. And while it should make up the majority of your training, the exact amount is sort of up for debate. But generally 80% is a good kind of rule of thumb for most. You'll get a huge amount of benefits from zone 2 training, and just remember that what your zone 2 is might be totally different for someone else. So make sure that when you've actually mapped your zones, it is actually something personal and individualized to you. But you also do need to make sure that you're getting a little bit of work in the other intensity zones, so don't neglect those. And you know, there's a lot of kind of, I suppose, a bit of a myth that a lot of long slow training slows you down. This isn't necessarily true. If you are tired and too fatigued to have a good quality speed session, then yes, you will probably lose some speed. But if you plan appropriately and do your zone 2 days where you should, and make sure that you recover from them, then you should have good quality fast or high intensity days. So there shouldn't be any loss of speed at all. You should have a nice blend of endurance and speed, or intensity, or whatever it is you're going for, maybe strength as well. So if you like this video, please make sure to subscribe, hit the like button and share with your friends. And I'm going to get on with the rest of my session now, so enjoy your next long one. And yeah, comment below with what's your longest zone 2 session, what's your typical long ride, how long does that look like for you? For me, a long ride's maybe 4 or 5 hours, a long run's maybe 2.5. I don't really plan on doing a huge amount more than that for the event distance that I like, but yeah, be interested to see what all of you like to do. See you next time.